Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jessica Petros. I work at John Burton Advocates for Youth, and our webinar today is on completing the FAFSA, a how-to for adult supporters of youth experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So before we begin, just wanted to go over a few logistics. First, there's two ways to be able to enable audio for this webinar. You can either click on the audio tab on your control panel and connect via your computer, or you can connect via your telephone. If you select telephone on the audio option, it will show the access code and PIN. Simply enter that into your phone and you'll be able to hear the audio. I've also entered those instructions in the chat box. We will also have opportunities for questions throughout the webinar. We won't be using the raise hand function, but if you have questions at any time, simply click on the questions tab on your control panel and chat those in the box, and we will be responding to those via chat throughout the webinar. And if there's time at the end, we'll conclude with a live Q&A as well. And lastly, today's presentation materials and the audio will be both recorded and emailed out to everyone that's registered for today. It will also be posted on our website at jbay.org if you just go to the Training and Events tab. And then you'll also see on the Handouts tab, I've attached the slides from today's webinar. So if you want to download them and view them right now, you can do that as well. Next slide. So we've got a great group of presenters today. Again, my name is Jessica Petros. I'm a Senior Project Manager at John Burton Advocates for Youth, also known as JBay. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Debbie Rauscher, our Education Director, Cody Van Felden, our Youth Advocate, and Melissa Bond, our Education Program Manager. And we're also really thrilled to be joined by Anna Faye Robinson today. She is the Director of Financial Aid at LA Pierce College and the 2020 President of CASPA, which is the California Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. So as you have questions coming in, Anna Faye will be on call to respond to any questions you have throughout the webinar. Next slide. So just a brief overview about what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. We'll start off with a bit of information about why financial aid matters and the important role you can play as an adult supporter. And then, of course, we'll be diving deep into how to apply for financial aid step by step, and then highlight some key steps after the FAFSA, additional updates on the Cal Grant, which will explain what that is later as well, and then leave you with some additional helpful resources to support you in your work with students. Next slide. So to kick us off, I'd like to turn it over to our youth advocate, Cody.
Thank you, Jessica. I want to thank everyone for joining us on today's webinar and taking the time to learn how to support youth who have experienced homelessness with their financial aid application. We know that financial aid makes a significant difference in student success in college. High school seniors that complete the FAFSA are 63% more likely to enroll in higher education. Students receiving at least $7,500 in financial aid, 49% have transferred or graduated. Students receiving $1,000 to $2,500, 17% have transferred or graduated. Next slide, please. New research indicates some alarming number of red flags that highlight how COVID-19 pandemic may be disproportionately negatively impacting minority students and those from the lower income backgrounds. Enrollment deposits are monetary payments that are required for students to secure their spot in the incoming class and register for classes. A recent study found that enrollment deposits have decreased by 6% among those students with most financial needs, those with expected family contributions or EFC below 10K. However, for Black students in the lower income bracket, deposits are down by 12%. In addition, FAFSA filings have decreased by 4% overall, but by 17.5% for Black students and 14.9% for Latinx students in the lower income bracket. Given the disproportionate numbers of youth experiencing homelessness who are Black and Latinx, this makes following through with students about the FAFSA and other college matriculation steps all the more important. Next slide, please. So as Jessica mentioned, my name is Cody. I'm a youth advocate at JBay. I am currently attending Sacramento State. My major is psychology and ASL. My first experience with FAFSA was a late submission due to no preparation in high school. My college I attended was Consumers River College. I had gone to them and they helped me fill out my FAFSA. Unfortunately, it was no help because my case was not typical for foster youth. They didn't know how to help me. This is why it is important to have adult support in these matters. If I received the help I needed, my outcome could have potentially been different. I became homeless a few months after completing my FAFSA. The money from FAFSA was able to help me survive. It was not enough to keep a steady place to live, but I didn't have to worry about food or school supplies. If something happened, I also had the money for transportation. Having financial aid while homeless did not solve all of my problems, but it did help a lot of them. It provides some stability, not as much as needed when youth are facing homelessness, but enough to hold on, especially while in school. Without financial aid, I wouldn't have been able to go to school. While homeless, it was hard to focus on anything else other than where I was going to be that night or in the future. It's scary and time-consuming. These feelings can massively affect your grades, and it did. I was almost dismissed from financial aid due to my inability to focus and do well in my classes. I did want to mention again from the earlier slide that I fall into those statistics of financial aid making a difference. I spent 5 years at Consumers River College. The first few years were not great, and I often doubted my ability to continue. Because of financial aid, though, I passed with straight A's my last 2 semesters, and as a highest honor student. I earned 3 AA degrees and transferred to Sacramento State. I want to thank everyone again for being here today, and I will now pass it back on to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Cody. Well, now we're going to dive in on how to apply for financial aid. Next slide. There are 2 types of applications that students can fill out depending on their citizenship status. The first option is the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid, and this is for students who are U.S. citizens or permanent residents or other eligible non-citizens. That might be someone who's a U.S. permanent resident who has a green card. And the students can fill out this application by simply going to the website fafsa.ed.gov. You'll actually see that it doesn't say www.fafsa. That will actually direct you to a different website, so make sure just to simply type in fafsa.ed.gov. Students can also fill out paper applications, but we highly recommend that they fill out the application online to reduce any chances of errors. And what we have on the screen is simply a screenshot of what that main login page looks like. Next slide. Students can also fill out their FAFSA on their smartphones using My Student Aid app, and they can actually start the application in the app and finish it on their desktop, or vice versa. They can start on the website on a computer and switch back to the app to finish it on there, so they have that flexibility as well. Next slide. The other type of application is the California DREAM Act application. This allows undocumented and non-resident documented students who meet certain eligibility requirements to apply for state financial aid. And it also allows these qualified students to pay in-state residence fees instead of the higher out-of-state fees. And this is for students who are attending California's public colleges and universities. Now, in today's climate, a lot of students might be nervous about self-identifying if they are undocumented. So just to keep in mind and also to reassure your students, this is an application through the California Student Aid Commission, also known as CSAC. And they keep all the data that's entered into the California DREAM Act application confidential. So you can let students know that their data will not be shared with or disclosed to any federal agencies, including immigration enforcement. Now, the California DREAM Act application, you can also let students know it does not link any of their information to federal government databases, but also it does not qualify students for federal financial aid programs, such as the federal Pell Grant, work study, or federal loans. This application is just for state financial aid, such as the Cal Grant. Now, if you are a California undocumented student, sometimes they might get confused about DACA. A student should still apply using the California DREAM Act application, even if they were a DACA recipient. A lot of times DACA recipients will be issued a temporary Social Security number. Even if they have that temporary Social Security number, they should still fill out the California DREAM Act application. And also, DACA and California DREAM Act applications, those are separate applications. So they do not need to have DACA in order to apply for the California DREAM Act application. In order to be eligible, students must demonstrate residency based on their attendance at California schools. And by going to the website listed on the screen, the students can find out more about what the eligibility requirements are in order to be able to fill out the California DREAM Act application. Also to note, most of the questions on the FAFSA mirror the California DREAM Act application. So for today's webinar, we're going to be reviewing the questions on the FAFSA and showing you screenshots of these questions. But please know that this webinar, it'll still equip you if you are working with a student who needs to fill out the California DREAM Act application. There's a few sections where the questions are a little different, and as we go through the FAFSA application, we'll highlight what those differences are in the webinar today as well. And similarly with the FAFSA, students can also fill out this application either online or via paper, but once again, we still highly recommend that they fill out the application on the website to minimize any errors. Next slide. Now, the FAFSA and the California DREAM Act, they both ask a series of questions to determine what's called the student's expected family contribution, also known as EFC. This states how much the student is able to contribute to the cost of attendance at their college or university. For most homeless youth, the EFC is going to be 0. Colleges and universities then look at their cost of attendance, COA. The cost of attendance is the total amount it costs to attend college. This includes tuition, the cost of housing, books, and supplies. Then the student's EFC is then subtracted from the cost of attendance to determine their eligibility for need-based aid. A few examples of need-based aid are things like the Cal Grant, the Pell Grant, or the Chafee Grant for foster youth. Next slide. So now you know the two different types of applications, either the FAFSA or the California DREAM Act application. So when should students apply? The priority application period is October 1st through March 2nd, before the start of the school year that the student will begin college. So right now, we're in the 2020-2021 school year. So students would be filling out their application between October 1st, 2020 and March 2nd, 2021, if they're planning on attending school the following year in 2021 to 2022. Students can actually apply after March 2nd and should definitely still be encouraged to apply if they miss that priority deadline, but they may receive less money depending on factors such as their intent to attend a community college or four-year university. Additionally, students can apply for financial aid even before they submit their college applications, so it's okay if they don't know yet where they plan to attend college. Now, some colleges, such as four-year universities, they may actually have earlier priority deadlines, so it's important that students are aware of the deadlines requested by their colleges that they're applying to. For best practice, as a general rule, have students apply as soon as possible. Next slide. Now, below is a list of items that a student should bring with them in order to be able to successfully fill out an application. So I recommend that you tell the students about these items ahead of time so they can come prepared when they meet with you to fill out the application. So for students filling out the FAFSA, they'll need either their social security number or their alien registration number. And make sure that the students know their name exactly as it appears on their social security card. A lot of times they might actually not know the name as it appears on that card. The other thing that students will need is their statewide student identifier number if they're filling out the California DREAM Act application. Now, this is not required, but it is recommended for those students just to help the process with their application. And if they don't know what this SSID number is, they can get it from their high school counselor. Additionally, the students will need an email address, and I recommend that they use an email address that they check often. So if you're working with a high school student, I would have them avoid any high school emails. A lot of times those expire, so you want them to use an email address that they'll be able to use long-term, like a Gmail. They'll also need to know a list of up to 10 colleges that they want to apply to. Now, they can definitely update this later, and we'll talk more about that process and how that works, but have them start to think about which colleges they want to apply to. And lastly, they'll need their students' tax or income information from the prior year. So if the student's planning on attending school in 2021 and 2022, and they're applying this year for that school year, they'll be requested to provide income that they received or earned for 2019. Now, most high school seniors and homeless students in general will not have made enough to file taxes, but they will still need to report any income that they've earned that year. However, if you are working with a student and they did make enough money and they did file taxes in 2019, they'll be able to use a tool in the FAFSA called the IRS Data Retrieval Tool to actually transfer their tax information from their federal income tax return into the FAFSA. And we'll show you later on in the webinar today how to do that as well. Next slide. So before we dive into how to fill out the application, it's important to note and recognize today's climate. So due to COVID-19 and distance learning, support for the FAFSA looks very different in today's world. Before we dive in how to fill out the FAFSA, we just wanted to share a few tips on how to support youth in this virtual world. One suggestion is to use video platforms such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams that allow screen sharing. So what can happen is the student can share their own screen as they're filling out the FAFSA, so you can see them fill out the questions, and then you can provide guidance to them and support with these questions. You can also do this over the phone. Another recommendation, though, is that the students make individual appointments for support. One-on-one assistance is very effective, so we really encourage that you don't rely on virtual workshops or drop-in hours as a primary strategy. That one-on-one assistance also assists in protecting the student's confidentiality. It's really important that the support is high touch. So for example, you don't want to just forward a youth an email about a resource. It's really just not enough. These days for students, they're so overwhelmed, they're overloaded with remote learning and bombarded with emails. So you'll need to find a way to really stand out in all the noise and get them connected with individualized assistance. And as mentioned before, it's important to start the process early. Start the conversations now. And lastly, incentives, while they're not required, they have been helpful in some counties and can still be provided virtually to students. So if you're exploring incentives as an option, what we've heard that some counties are doing is sending their students swag bags of college goodies, and others are sending students e-gift cards. So there are still ways to provide incentives virtually as well. Next slide. All right, so let's begin the FAFSA. When students go to the website at fafsa.ed.gov, this is the page that pops up. And just as a reminder, the FAFSA must be filled out every year, and this is a free application. So if they're a new user and starting the process for the first time, they click Start Here. And if they're a returning user, they click Log In. And this will allow the student to pre-fill the current year's FAFSA data with some of the data from their prior year's FAFSA. Next slide. So once they click Start Here, they'll be prompted to create what's called an FSA ID, or a Federal Student Aid Identification. Next slide. So when they click the Start Here button, they come to this login page. There's two options. They can either select I am the student or I am a parent. You'll want them to select I am the student. You'll then see, if this is their first time, there's a little blue button called Create One. Have them click that, and that will take them to a separate page to create their FSA ID. And the FSA ID will serve as their legal signature, and they'll need it to sign their FAFSA electronically at the end before they can submit the FAFSA. Next slide. So this is what it looks like when they're brought to the FSA ID page. They'll be asked a series of questions. The first one's asking them to enter their name and their social security number. And again, making sure that they enter that exactly as it appears on their social security card. If there's any errors, there'll be an error on their FAFSA. If they don't know their social security number, they can find it sometimes on their W-2, or You can even reach out to your school. They may have it on record as well. Now, if they don't have a Social Security number, they shouldn't be filling out the FAFSA. They would be applying for the California DREAM Act application, and we provided that website earlier. Next slide. Next, they create a username and password that can easily be remembered. And here they also enter an email address, again, reminding them to use one that they check often and to avoid any of those high school email addresses that may expire. Next slide. Here they enter their mailing address, mobile phone number, and they can also indicate if they want to set up a mobile phone account for recovery in case they get locked out. But just to remind you as well, the mobile phone number, it's not required, but it is recommended. It's just another option in case they need to get into their account. Next slide. Here, they just indicate how they'd like to receive future communications. They can either receive it by mail or by email, although we highly recommend that they receive information via email, and then they select their indicated preferred language. Next slide. Here they select challenge questions and answers that they can remember in case they forget their FSA ID. Sometimes these can be personal questions, so you might want to be able to be available to support the student with these questions in case any of them might be triggering. Next slide. And then lastly, they have to verify either their email address if they provided an email or their phone number if they entered a mobile phone number. If they entered both an email and a mobile phone number, they'll have to verify and authenticate both of those. So once they do that, then they just simply click finish and they will have created their FSA ID. Next slide. So students experiencing homelessness are often under high stress, and they may have difficulty remembering the various passwords and usernames that they just created. So make sure to work with the student to create a system to safely store the various passwords and usernames that they just created. One idea is to write it on a piece of paper that they can store in their wallet, or if they have a cell phone, they can enter it maybe in a note section in their cell phone if they have one. Next slide. So now that they have their FSA ID, they'll go back to the FAFSA website to log in with this new ID. Next slide. So again, they're back on the login page. They select I am the student, and they enter in either their FSA ID username, or if they used an email address to create their FSA ID, they can log in with their email, or they can log in with the mobile number if they chose to use that when creating their FSA ID. And then they enter their password, and they're able to log in. Next slide. Here they select the school year where they are applying for financial aid. Students often make a lot of errors here. This is based on the school year that they plan to attend college, not their current year in school. And if they select the wrong year, their financial aid will not be processed. So another thing to note, though, too, is some of your students might be planning on taking classes during summer. And if they are, it's recommended that they complete applications for both years, both the current academic school year and the next academic school year. The reason for this is that schools actually have the option of using either the prior or the upcoming year's financial aid for the summer. So once the students pick a college, have them check with the financial aid office about how they manage summer financial aid. Next slide. Once they're in the application, they'll need to create a save key in case they need to save their application and finish it later. You can actually return within 45 days to complete and submit the FAFSA. Next slide. And the save key is yet another item that a student may easily forget. So add this to the list of items to write down and store safely for the student. Next slide. Here you'll see that there are 8 sections listed as tabs at the top of the screen for the FAFSA. So the website is going to take them through each section, one question at a time. The student can click Save at the top of the screen at any time to save their entries as they go along. And you'll see that if they don't respond to all of the questions, the system will alert them to complete the questions before they move on to the next section. If students are confused about any of the questions, they can get more information for each question by clicking the blue question mark icon that you see listed there. And you'll also notice at the top when seeing the different sections that there's a parent demographics section and a parent financial section. Students who are deemed as independent students will actually be able to skip those sections, and we'll discuss what independent student status means and how a student can qualify for that in the dependency status section later in the webinar. So to start off, we'll begin with the first section, which is student demographics. Next slide. Next slide. Here you'll see the student's social security number will actually preload from creating an FSA ID. So again, have the student double check, make sure that their name and social security number matches exactly as it appears on their social security card. The student will then be asked to enter their name and date of birth, and again, making sure that it matches what's on the card. This will be their legal name and not a nickname. Next slide. Here they enter their email address. Double check the email address to make sure that there's no typos. The U.S. Department of Education and the colleges that you apply for financial aid will send FAFSA reminders, status updates, and financial aid application results to this email address. So it's important that it's entered correctly. Students can also enter a telephone number, but this is optional. Next slide. Here they enter a permanent mailing address. This should be the same address that you use on official government documents, such as tax returns or voter registration cards. This is an address where the student can receive postal mail. So if you don't have a permanent address, you can definitely use a P.O. box or any other address where you can collect mail. And if you don't have this available, maybe you're working with a student who doesn't have a permanent address or a P.O. box, have them talk to their college's financial aid administrator for help. A lot of times the colleges will work with the students and even allow them to receive mail at their campus if they're homeless. Next slide. Here it asks a question about their state of legal residence. If you select that you have lived in California for at least 5 years, you may be eligible for the California State Student Aid application. This is known as the Cal Grant. Now, to note, a separate application is not required for California State Student Aid, but you may need to make sure that your high school or your college, if you're already a college student, has submitted your verified GPA, and that it's been matched to your FAFSA or your California DREAM Act application. Students must have at least a 2.0 GPA to be eligible for the Cal Grant. So for a student to verify if their GPA has been submitted, they'll need to create a Web Grants account. And we'll talk more about this at the end of the training. If the answer is no, that they have not lived in California for at least 5 years, then they'll need to provide the date that they became a legal resident of California. It'll also ask them, are you a U.S. citizen? And if they select no, but I am an eligible non-citizen, this is where they will provide their alien registration number. Now, again, if the student is not a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, the student should stop and complete the California DREAM Act application instead. Next slide. Here we have various questions about their education. The first question being, what will their high school completion status be when they begin college? The options are high school diploma, GED, homeschooled, or none of the above. It'll then ask them about their initial educational goal. Now, some students may not know, they're not sure. One of the options is other or undecided. It's important to not select other or undecided, as it can actually limit the grants that the student can receive. If you are uncertain, maybe you're not sure if you want to attend a 2-year or a 4-year, we recommend that you select 4-year college. It'll actually open up more opportunities for financial aid. One of the other options on the drop-down is second bachelor's degree. It's important to not select second bachelor's degree unless they've already completed their first bachelor's degree, because that can limit the grants that they receive as well. The other question will be, what will their college grade level be when they begin the 2021-22 school year? Now, for most students, it's going to be, particularly your high school students, it's going to be never attended college or first year. But if you took college courses while you were in high school, these are students that were duly enrolled. Just to note that they are still considered a first-time college student, and they can still select the option of never attended college/first year. It's also going to ask that student if they're interested in work study. We encourage the students to answer yes. Many students may not know what work study is, so this can be an opportunity for you to educate them. Essentially, federal work study allows students with financial need to earn a portion of their financial aid award money through part-time employment, either on or off campus. So students can decline it later if they change their mind and they decide, actually, I don't want to do work study. Also, answering yes will not guarantee that they receive it. It just opens up the opportunity for them to be awarded it. Next slide. Here are the students asked, are you male or female? This is based on their sex at birth as indicated on their birth certificate. They'll also be asked if they're registered with the Selective Service System. Now, males are required to register with the Select Service System to complete their FAFSA. And if they haven't registered yet, the FAFSA makes it very easy, and they'll be able to use it to automatically register with the Selective Service. So if they answer no, then a question pops up that says, well, would you like to register for the Selective Service? And they can simply click yes and be automatically registered into the system. So federal law requires that most male U.S. citizens and immigrants who are living in the U.S., if they're between 18 to 25, that they register with the Selective Service. Also to note, if you're working with any transgender students, they still have to comply with the Selective Service registration requirement, and it's based on the student's sex at birth as it's listed on the student's birth certificate. California DREAM Act applicants, they also will be required to register for the Selective Service, but they won't be able to do it electronically in their application. They'll actually have to do it via mail. Next slide. Here's where they can enter a driver's license. Just to note, though, that this is not required to complete the application, but it can help prevent with identity theft. Also, the student's driving record or maybe any parking tickets that they have, it does not affect their eligibility for financial aid. Next slide. This question asks, are you a foster youth or were you at any time in the foster care system? Many of the students you're working with, in addition to experiencing homelessness, they may have also been in the foster care system. We want to encourage them to answer yes to this question, even if they were in the foster care system for just one day. Answering yes may actually give them access to more support and resources and programs that are on their campus to help them in college. Now, this question is not on the California DREAM Act application, it's just on the FAFSA. They're then asked about the highest school level completed by their parents. If they know this information, they can definitely enter it, but it's also totally fine just to select other or unknown if they don't know this information. Also to note, the parent, it's not referring to a legal guardian or a foster parent. And if they do enter other or unknown, it does not affect their eligibility for federal student aid. Next slide. Now, this is a question for students who might be returning to college. If this is not your first year in college, you'll be asked if you have ever received federal student aid. If your eligibility for federal student aid has been suspended due to a drug conviction, you can actually regain eligibility early by completing an approved drug rehabilitation program or by passing 2 unannounced drug tests that are administered by an approved drug rehab program. The reason for this is you'll be asked if you've been convicted for the possession or sale of illegal drugs for an offense that occurred while receiving federal student aid. So you cannot commit those types of crimes while receiving federal student aid. But if you aren't eligible for federal student aid, we encourage you to still complete and submit your FAFSA form because you might be eligible for state or school financial aid. And the other good news is that if they do lose their eligibility, like I said earlier, they can regain it in the future as well. Next slide. So here we have the school selection section. Next slide. If you indicated that you are still in high school or that you've completed your high school diploma in the prior student demographics section, this is when you'll then be asked a series of questions about the high school. They'll enter the name of the high school, the city, and the state. If they said that they received their GED, then they won't have to provide these questions. We highly encourage, though, that the student uses the search function to enter their high school instead of entering the information in manually. This will help to reduce any errors. Next slide. So in this example, the student used the search function. They entered West High School, and as you can see, there's many West High Schools, so they just select the one that pertains to them from the list. Next slide. Here they search for and select up to 10 colleges that they may want to attend. The information from the FAFSA will be sent to the schools that they've selected. You can actually update or change the school selections later if your plans change, or maybe you're just not sure yet where you want to go. That's okay. The student, though, they have to select at least one college to continue with the FAFSA. And as mentioned before, you don't have to have applied yet for admission to the college. They can fill this out before they've actually applied to the college. Next slide. After the FAFSA has been processed, the student will receive what's called a student aid report or SAR notification, and then they can submit, if they want, to the FAFSA an additional 10 colleges. The way it works is they would then log back into the FAFSA, remove the original set of 10 colleges, and they can add a new set of up to 10 colleges. The original set of 10 colleges will still receive their copy of the FAFSA information, and the student can repeat this process as many times as necessary. Each time, though, they just have to wait until their SAR or SAR notification is sent to them to be able to make those changes. Just to note, too, have the students be careful when they're selecting their colleges. Some of the colleges' names might be very similar, so the student might get confused. And be sure to list each UC and CSU campus to which you're applying for admission separately in this section. Next slide. This page asks you to indicate your housing plans for each campus. Now, most four-year universities or colleges offer on-campus housing. Only a few community colleges in California offer on-campus housing. We want to encourage the students, do not select with parent as their housing plan if they're living with a foster parent or a relative caregiver or legal guardian. If they are living with a foster parent, relative caregiver, or legal guardian, have them instead select off campus. This will help the students get additional money to help with their living expenses. Also, to note, the order in which they list the colleges does not make a difference in California. Next slide. Great, so here we have the dependency status section, and I'm going to turn it over to Debbie Rauscher to walk you through this.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. So I'm going to talk about dependency status. So this section of the application determines whether a student is considered dependent or independent for the purposes of financial aid. So a student who is independent does not have to provide any information, including income information, from their parents. Their aid is determined solely based off of their own income. And that's really crucial, of course, in terms of maximizing the amount of financial aid that's available. So if we can go to the next slide. So there are a number of questions that the application will take the student through to determine if they meet any one of a number of different criteria that would qualify that student as independent. So the first question is whether they're married, because married students are considered independent. So it's going to ask them to specify their marital status. It's important to make sure that students understand that they would answer the question as single if they're not married. So even if they have a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a significant other, they're living with a significant other, they would still be single in that circumstance if they're not legally married. Go to the next slide. So the next question asks about whether the student has dependents, in other words, whether they're a parent, because students who have their own children in their custody or who they are supporting, those students are also automatically considered independent. And so it'll ask a couple of questions about whether they have children who receive more than half of their support from the student, or students who live with them for at least half time. And so they would indicate yes or no to those questions. Now, the next slide, and I should say that after you answer those initial dependency questions, you don't get, once you're determined to be independent, you don't necessarily get asked all the rest of the dependency status questions. So once you're independent, it skips a number of slides moving forward. But assuming that they've said, no, they're not married, no, they don't have children, they would then ask a series of questions shown on the screen here for a bunch of other criteria for independent status. So if they're active duty military or a veteran, if they were in foster care after the age of 13, if they're an emancipated minor, or if they're in legal guardianship. If they can answer yes to any one of these questions, they should definitely do so. I'm going to talk in a minute about how homeless status qualifies a student for independent status. But things like, for example, being in foster care don't require once you're in foster care in the past, you've always been in foster care in the past, and so you don't have to worry about recertifying. Whereas with homeless status, you have to recertify every year that you continue to meet the definition to qualify for independent status as a homeless or at-risk student. But assuming the student doesn't meet any of these criteria, they would select none of the above. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I think we hadn't switched. So this is the slide I was just talking about a minute ago. So these are the different criteria for independent status. But assuming the person selects none of the above, we can go to the next slide. So then we get into the homeless questions. The application asks on or after July 1st, 2020, and of course every year this year changes, but for the application for the 2021/22 academic year, it would ask on or after July 1st, 2020, were you homeless, or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? And so the student is going to indicate yes or no to this question. So what exactly does that mean? If we can go to the next slide. So the definition of homeless youth is a little bit complicated. One, the student has to be unaccompanied, in other words, not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So if the student is homeless, but is homeless with their parent or guardian, they don't meet the definition of homeless youth for the FAFSA in order to qualify for independent status. If they are unaccompanied, then they also have to be either homeless or what's called self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So the definition of homelessness essentially is lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. And I'm going to talk about more detail about what that means on the next slide, but that's homelessness. Or self-supporting, meaning the student is paying his or her own, actually if we can stay on the Yeah. When a student is paying for his or her own living expenses, including their housing, and at risk of being homeless. So there's the possibility that the student's housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. A note that a student living in any of these situations who is fleeing an abusive parent may be considered homeless, even if that parent would provide support and a place to live. If we can go to the next slide. So what does it mean to a lack of fixed, regular, and adequate housing? So essentially, there's a number of different types of living situations that are specified in the law that meet this criteria. So the first is sharing housing of other persons due to the loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. Essentially, this means couch surfing. And this is really important to understand because there are other definitions of homelessness, in particular for HUD-funded housing programs, that don't consider somebody who's couch surfing to be homeless for the purposes of those programs. But for the purposes of FAFSA independent status, if the person doesn't have fixed, regular, and adequate housing, they're bouncing around from person to person to different locations, they are considered homeless for the purposes of the FAFSA, as well as other more sort of traditional situations that qualify as homeless, such as living in a motel or hotel or a trailer park or camping ground because of a lack of adequate alternative accommodations, living in an emergency shelter, or living someplace that's not typically used as an accommodation. So sleeping in your car, in park, public spaces, an abandoned building, if you're living in substandard housing, or any similar setting. Next slide. So once the student has established that, yes, they do meet this definition, they do qualify as homeless, they check that box, it then asks the student, and this gets a little complicated, whether they can receive a determination or have received a determination from one of three specific entities. So the first is the McKinney-Vento liaison at their high school or at their school district. The second would be an emergency shelter or transitional housing program that receives funding from HUD. And the third would be the director of a runaway or homeless youth basic center or transitional living program. And that third one indicates it's a very specific type of program that receives funding from something called the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. There's not a ton of those programs in California. Most students who are able to receive verification typically do receive it from their high school liaison, but they certainly can receive it from one of these other entities as well. So if, let's say there's a student who can receive a verification from one of these entities, they would check the appropriate box, and then we go to the next slide. And then they want to make sure that they have that verification letter on hand. And so we included a link here to Schoolhouse Connection. They have a great template that one of the somebody in that category, the homeless liaison or a director of a HUD shelter or an RHYA shelter, can fill out. One thing to note about that template for the determination letter, if you were to click on that link and go look at it, essentially just it's kind of just yes or no. And so, does this student meet the definition? Yes, no, signature. The person does not have to provide any information about the circumstances of their homeless, how they became homeless, why they're homeless, where they're living. If one of those three entities verifies it, that the financial aid office must accept that verification as valid. They don't need to know anything further about the circumstances. Next slide. So if the person did get letters of verification, checked one of those boxes, it then goes on to ask them about their household size. The information auto-populates for themselves and their spouse if they indicated they were married. They would then indicate how many children they have, and it also asks them about how many people in their household will be attending college. Typically, for most students, this is going to be one. It's going to be just them, unless they're married and their spouse is also attending college, or their significantly older and they have college-age children who are attending college alongside them, but for most students, this is going to be 1. And one thing to note in terms of household size, just make sure that youth understand that this is referring to spouse and dependent children. So if they are living with siblings or other relatives, or they're in group housing, or they have roommates, none of those people are considered household size. Their household is them, their spouse, and their children for an independent student. Next slide. It would then ask them if they want to answer questions about their parents. I would say no to this question. There's no reason for them. There's no downside to not providing information about the parents once they've been determined to be independent. So they can go ahead and answer no. It would then skip the parent demographics and the parent financials sections to go straight to student financials. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about a circumstance where a student cannot get verification from one of the 3 listed entities. So in that scenario, they can still be classified as homeless to get independent status. They would select none of the above. And then if we go to the next slide, then they're going to get kind of a notification here that says that they were homeless, that they've indicated on their FAFSA that they're homeless, and that they need to reach out to their financial aid administrator to make a determination as to whether they meet the definition of homelessness. So it gives a little bit of information about what it means to be homeless, what it means to be unaccompanied, just to make sure that the student really understands and is clear that yes, they do meet that definition. And then they have to click next to continue. So next slide. So then another kind of warning comes up, basically telling the student that they can continue and not provide information about their parents. However, the expected family contribution, which is what needs to get calculated in order to determine how much financial aid they qualify for, will not get calculated until the student follows up with the financial aid administrator at their college in order to get their status as a homeless youth verified. So this is just a warning to them that they won't see that EFC, that there is going to be follow-up necessary with the financial aid office to be confirmed as a homeless student, at which point the EFC will be calculated and the FAFSA will be finalized. So the FAFSA just wants to make sure that they understand that there are additional steps necessary for their financial aid to get processed. Next slide. So then it asks them once again, just wants to double, triple check. Yes, they do believe that they are unaccompanied and homeless or at risk of being homeless. They are not going to provide information about their parents. If the student realizes at this point, oh, actually, I don't meet that definition, it turns out, then they would say, I'm going to provide information about my parents, and they would go on to those sections and would not be considered an independent student. But assuming the student says, yes, I'm unaccompanied and homeless or at risk of being homeless, they'll check the box, click next, and we can go on to the next slide. So at this point, they do need to reach out to the financial aid office at their college and work with the financial aid administrator to be verified as a homeless student. Financial aid administrators have quite a lot of flexibility around how they conduct this verification. So financial aid administrators can get assistance with making the determination by contacting a whole range of people. So if the student is living in a shelter, they can contact that person, or they can contact the college access program if the student is participating, or a medical provider, or a therapist, or a social worker. They have a lot of discretion in terms of reaching out to a range of other professionals who are supporting that student to confirm and get the verification that the student meets that definition. Now, if there's no written documentation available, and we know this is often the case, if a student is, say, sleeping in their car, they haven't necessarily told anybody, they're embarrassed about that, they haven't been working with any professional around addressing their homeless situation. So if there's no written documentation available, the financial aid administrator may make a determination based on a documented interview with the student. So this is really important to know. Sometimes it requires some advocacy to ensure that the financial aid office understands that they don't need written documentation, that they can ask the student to describe, here's where I'm living, sleeping in my car, this is where I park it, and that they can just document that they had that conversation, and that serves as verification of homeless status. Another thing to be aware of is that financial aid administrators are instructed in the guidance that they receive that they should not be asking personal questions about the circumstances, for example, that led to a student becoming homeless. So what they are verifying is that where that student is staying meets the definition of homelessness, that it's a location that's not adequate and consistent and stable housing. So if the student says, I'm sleeping in my car, I've been in my car for the last 3 months, that clearly would qualify that student as homeless. The financial aid administrator does not need to delve more deeply into, well, what happened? How'd you end up in your car? What, those kind of personal questions shouldn't be asked. As I mentioned before, if a student receives a determination from one of those 3 kind of special designated folks, the McKinney-Vento liaison or the RHYA or HUD-funded shelter, the financial aid administrator must accept that determination unless they have direct information to the contrary. They need to accept that information and shouldn't be asking additional questions about the student's housing circumstance. Guidance also specifies that a student who's living in a school dorm may still be considered homeless as an unaccompanied homeless youth if the student would be homeless otherwise, if they didn't have access to that dorm. And in addition, a new determination must be made each year for the purposes of the FAFSA in order for that student to maintain independent status as a homeless student. Now, they may be able to get independent status through some other means if they turn 24 or if they have children or are married or something. But if they're going to continue to get independent status by virtue of their homeless status, then that does need to be determined each year. So that is the dependency section, and I'm now going to turn it over to Melissa, who's going to talk about student financials.
Great, thanks so much, Debbie. So again, my name is Melissa Vaughn. I'm also with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and I'll bring us to the end of this presentation and through the conclusion of the FAFSA. So for many students and applicants, the most difficult part about filling out the FAFSA form is entering the financial information. In this section, I will walk you through the student financial sections and mention 3 options that students can select regarding their income tax information. So option A is if you select already completed IRS income tax return. Option B is if you select will file the IRS income tax return. And option C is if you select not going to file IRS income tax return. So just to note, we will cover the 2 most common scenarios, option A and option C. And for interest of time, we're going to skip over option B, which is a less common scenario. So let's dive in. On this page, you will be asked about student financials. Pay careful attention to which year's income, tax, and asset information you have to report in this section. FAFSA uses income and tax information from the prior year. So for example, the 2021-2022 FAFSA, which is filled out between October 1st of 2020 and March 2nd of 2021, will ask for the 2019 tax and income information. Take special note of that. Any asset information is based on the date the FAFSA is filed. So as noted, you will be asked if you completed your IRS income tax return for the appropriate year, and you must select one of the 3 options that I already mentioned. Already completed, will file, or not going to file. Again, as I mentioned, we will cover just the 2 most common scenarios, already completed or not going to file. Will file refers if they missed the filing deadline, but still plan to file taxes in 2019.
Hey, Melissa, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. It looks like the slides haven't changed. Have they changed on your end? Just want to see if there's a problem.
Oh, they have changed on my end. I am on the slide 66. It says option A.
Okay, yeah, they're not changing for some reason. Maybe, do you want to close out of the PowerPoint real quick and come back in and try again? I'm not sure, something maybe froze up on GoToWebinar's end. Sorry, everybody, for this.
Oh yeah. I didn't even see that. Let's try this. Can you see anything yet?
Now, I'm gonna see if I can, I think, did you exit screen sharing?
Let's see, I can make you the presenter, perhaps? Did that work?
No, we're still seeing the verification through FAA slide.
All right, Debbie, I just made you the presenter.
Okay, I'm gonna, give me 1 second. Let me just put the PowerPoint in slideshow mode. All right, folks, just give me 1 second.
Oh, I just got a message that says we are experiencing difficulties with the audio conference. You will be unable to use.
Okay, are folks seeing my screen now, Jessica?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead. Hopefully, Melissa, you're seeing this. We're on the student financial section, and I'll go ahead and change the slides. You can just tell me when to move along.
Okay, super. I was on slide 66 with option A. Okay, so we're going to start with the first option that students can select, which is already completed. Next slide, please. So if the student has already filled their 2019 taxes, they will see the option to link to the IRS, where they can automatically pull their information from the IRS website using their data retrieval tool. It is highly recommended that students use links to the IRS and use this data retrieval tool. Otherwise, they will have to manually enter all the information from their tax return, which understandably would increase the likelihood that errors would be made. So if for some reason they choose to enter their tax return information manually and do not have a copy of their return, they can download a free transcript from the IRS website. We have the link listed on the screen. So if you select already completed, you will select link to IRS to transfer your federal income tax return information directly into the FAFSA from the IRS using the DRT or data retrieval tool. To protect security of tax information, you will not be able to see the actual information that is being transmitted. If you have difficulty with the DRT or it's not working for some reason, you can manually enter the information from your federal income tax return. If you don't have a copy of your tax return, you can download a free transcript at irs.gov-transcript or request a federal income tax return transcript by filing IRS Form 4506-T, which can be found at the website also on the slide here. If you see a reference to a $50 fee, it means that you have the wrong form, IRS Form 4506 instead of IRS Form 4506-T. Again, it is highly recommended that students use the DRT instead of manually entering their information. This can help to prevent errors. Next slide, please. So after students click link to IRS button, the screen will pop up informing them that they are leaving the FAFSA website. They can simply click proceed to the IRS site. Leaving FAFSA on the web will display when going to the IRS website. It will inform you that the IRS tax information will not display for your protection. Next slide, please. After they click proceed to the IRS site, a warning message will pop up confirming that they want to actually leave the IRS data retrieval tool and is for authorized use only. The warning text appears as the 2019-20 IRS data retrieval tool site is displayed. They simply click OK to proceed. Next slide, please. So this is the IRS data retrieval tool. Most of the information on the screen will auto-populate from the information they already entered into the FAFSA. Even though the fields at the top are pre-filled based on the FAFSA responses, the first name, last name, date of birth, and the filing date can be updated on this page. Note that the Social Security number cannot be updated. Next slide, please. The student will need to input their address, and the important thing to note here is that the address entered must be the address that they reported on their 2019 income tax return. This is how they look up the information in the system. Once they enter their address, they can click Submit. Note that even though the fields at the top are pre-filled based on the FAFSA responses, again, the first name, last name, date of birth, and filing status can be updated on this page. And as I noted, the Social Security number cannot. Next page, please. Next, they will see a screen giving them the option to transfer now. Or if for some reason they no longer want to use the IRS DRT, they can click Do Not Transfer My Information. They can simply select Transfer Now, and they will be taken back to the main FAFSA application where they left off. You are again notified on this page that the information will not display on the IRS page or on the FAFSA.edu.gov site. Next slide, please. After the data has been transferred, it will show as transferred from the IRS in each field. It is important to note that the information will be preloaded and it won't show exact numbers for privacy and security purposes. This also means that the information cannot be edited or changed at this point. Next slide, please. Students may either choose to enter the IRS tax manually, or sometimes there are issues with this tool and it may not be working. There is a screenshot indicating that they would select No Thanks if they want to manually enter all of their tax return information. We won't be reviewing all of those options today, but the process is pretty straightforward in that it tells them line by line which questions and information they're looking for from their tax returns. Again, it is highly recommended that they use the IRS DRT to minimize any errors with entering the information manually. Next slide. So now we're on to option C. As noted, for the sake of time, we skipped over option B and we're going straight to C. This is the most likely common scenario for students who are high school seniors or for those who do not work at all or enough in 2019 to be required to file taxes. Next slide, please. So in this page, select Not Going to File if you did not work or did not make enough money that requires you to file taxes for the requested year. Most students, particularly our high school seniors, will select this option. Are you unsure if you made enough money to file taxes? Each year, the income requirement is different. For example, in 2019, if you were single, under 65, and your gross earned income was at least $12,200, then you needed to file a tax return. Again, this is the likely most common scenario for our high school seniors. Note, 30% of all students get flagged by the federal government to provide verification of information provided on their FAFSA. In addition, many colleges may also request further verification. Many homeless youth may be required to submit a verification of non-filing letter to the IRS to verify that they did not file taxes. On the left, you will see a link for directions on how to obtain the IRS verification of non-filing form. So I want to spend a moment explaining what this means and why it's important. Every year, the Department of Education sets out to verify the eligibility of about 30% of federal aid applicants. If a student who did not need to file a tax return because they did not meet the $12,200 income threshold in 2019 is flagged for verification, they will be asked to produce what is called the IRS verification of non-filing form to verify that they did not file taxes. The VNF is not an indication that the person is not required to file their tax return, just that they did not file one. Under normal times, requesting this form was a significant challenge for our youth. The VNF can be requested online or via mail. However, due to COVID-19, the IRS has stopped processing transfer requests by mail until further notice. Recent guidance from the Department of Education, dated July 9th, allows foster youth to waive this requirement and sign an affidavit letter stating that they did not file taxes. Students should consult with their financial aid office for assistance. So students will be informed if the VNF is required via their student aid report or the FAFSA, on the FAFSA, or from their institution via personal email, college email, or student portal. So it's very important to note, if a student is flagged to provide verification, their financial aid will not be processed and awarded until the necessary paperwork is completed. This process can be complicated, and the student may need your help to produce the required documentation. Next slide, please. So even if a student did not make enough money to file taxes, they're still going to be asked to report any income they received or earned in 2019. The first question they will be asked is how much they earned from working, which is pretty straightforward. If they did not earn income from working, they can simply enter 0. Next slide, please. So in the next series of questions, they will be asked if they paid child support or had earnings from a cooperative education program or co-op, which is offered by a college. This is paid experience through a college course. If you received federal work study, you must enter the information twice in the FAFSA so that it is subtracted when determining your total income. First, include the amount in the total provided when asked how much did you earn from working. Then also provide the amount in additional financial info section that says taxable earnings from need-based employment programs such as federal work study and need-based employment portions of fellowships and assistantships. You will actually deduct it when determining their total income, so it won't be counted against them. Next slide, please. So this next section covers some of the less common types of untaxed income that the student may have received. Note that these less common types of untaxed income do not need to be reported, but you can click help on the page there for a more complete list of all of these kind of less common scenarios. Next slide, please. So the next question they'll be asked is if they want to skip questions about their assets, since this comes up as an optional question. We encourage students to click yes so they can skip the questions. Otherwise, they'll be asked about how much money they currently have in their checking and savings accounts and the value of any investments that they may have. It's important to remind students that there is no penalty for skipping this question because it's optional and it won't affect whether or not their application is considered complete. Next slide, please. So we're almost there. Sign and submit. So we are almost to the conclusion of the FAFSA. The next slide, please. So it's going to first ask if the person filling out the screen is a preparer. The answer generally is no, even if you're an adult sitting with the student and helping them to complete the application. You're not considered a preparer in this circumstance. So the takeaway is select no, even if an adult or mentor is assisting the youth in completing the application. They are not considered preparers in this way. Next slide. So the next screen shows a summary of all the questions that they filled out. They can select expand all to have a detailed view of their whole application. The student should consider printing out a copy of this page and reviewing the printout before submitting just to double check themselves. Applicants may be less likely to notice problems when reading the application on the screen. So once they have confirmed that everything is answered in an accurate and correct manner, they can click next to go on to the next page. Next slide, please. So they will now see an agreement of terms, and they have to click that they agree before they can proceed. Once they select agree, they can click next. Next page, please. So almost there. This is the 2020-2021 sign and submit page for an independent student. Since the applicant entered his or her FAFSA ID to log into the FAFSA, they are not requested to provide their FSA ID username and password again to sign the application. Once they click sign the FAFSA, they will have to click next to proceed. And we'll move on to the next slide as well. Thanks. Once the student clicks next, they will see the screen to submit the FAFSA. A lot of students think that they are done at this point because the FAFSA shows that it was signed electronically, but they still need to submit My FAFSA now. This is a common mistake, and a lot of students don't end up with their FAFSA being processed here. So be very, very careful to make sure that the students click submit. Many often don't get to this page and their FAFSA is not processed. Next slide, please. So once they click submit My FAFSA now, they will see a screen that says, congratulations, your FAFSA was successfully submitted to federal student aid. This is what you want to see. Ideally, students will print and save this page for their records. If not, a copy will also be emailed to them. So they want to save that just to keep good records. It can take about 3 to 5 days for the FAFSA to be processed. If they need to make any changes to their contact information, add or change the schools they've listed, or update their income tax return information, they will need to wait until they receive their student aid report, which should be also received after a few days to a few weeks. They'll just have to be patient and watch out for that. Also to note, on the top of the screen, they will see their confirmation as well as their data release number, or DRN. This is important for them to save as well should they need to make any changes or if there are any errors. The takeaway here that this is your confirmation page to show that your FAFSA was successfully submitted. It provides your confirmation number and data release number should there be any issues. Next slide, please. So after the FAFSA, as a reminder, filing out the FAFSA is just the first step. After the application is processed, the students will want to log back in to make sure that there weren't any errors. Next slide, please. This slide shows the 2020-2021 My FAFSA page when an application has been submitted. The applicant has several choices here. They can make a correction by choosing Make FAFSA Corrections, or they can view and print their Student Aid Report, or SAR, in one of two formats by selecting View or Print Your Student Aid Report. If they choose Make FAFSA Corrections, they will be taken to a page asking them for their FAFSA ID username, FAFSA ID password, and save key. Choosing View or Print Your FAFSA Aid Report will take the applicant to a page asking for their FAFSA ID username, FAFSA ID password, and from there, they will be able to view their SAR. Next slide. Here is a screenshot of a sample student aid report. The SAR summarizes the information provided on the FAFSA. It includes their data release number, DRN, and expected family contributions, EFC, which we reviewed previously. In this case, the EFC is 0, which means that they will likely qualify for more aid. This is not your award letter, but it is an estimate of what you may be eligible for. Again, 30% of all students will be flagged for verification, so it's important that they respond to any requests for further documentation. Next slide. So next, let's talk about setting up a web grants account. You can create this to view the status of your FAFSA, CADAA, or Chafee grant if applicable. Next slide. So web grants can be used to manage your Cal Grant. But first, what is a Cal Grant? So the Cal Grants are free cash for college in California for students. Students must be a California resident or eligible immigrant student status. Students must meet income eligibility, getting at least a 2.0 GPA, applying within 1 year after high school, and they must submit a FAFSA or CADAA by March 2nd. Students must receive a high school diploma or a high school equivalency test, and they must be enrolled at least half-time. High school students must make sure that their high school submits their GPA verification form by the deadline. It is the student's responsibility to ensure that their high school submits their GPA. If the GPA is not submitted and matched with their FAFSA or CADAA application, they will not qualify for the Cal Grant, so beware of that. Next slide, please. Students will also need to wait to create a web grants account until after the FAFSA or CADAA application has been processed. like we mentioned, it can take 1 to 2 weeks for the FAFSA to process and link to web grants. So folks should just be patient and keep track of that just to make sure everything flows. Should they encounter any issues with creating an account, we encourage them to reach out directly to CSAC for assistance. Next slide. And this slide just shows a to-do list for web grants to be mindful of. And it includes, checking your award status for the right amount, verifying that there aren't any pending items, confirming that your school of attendance is accurate, verifying that the GPA has been received, and entering your high school graduation date, etc. All of those important pieces of information that should be entered properly. Just make sure that you're monitoring for that accuracy as well. Next slide, please. And here's a screen where you can edit contact information. Just wanted to show that so you see what that looks like. And just to make sure that your contact information is up to date so CSAC can reach you for any reason. Next slide. And here is the page that shows 3 different award status cards that can be displayed to students. They will either see awarded, pending, or not awarded. Each has a corresponding button that provides more information, and you can click each button to see more information. Next slide. So we encourage students to look at their application status and web grants to make sure that everything looks okay. When a student has not yet been processed for an award, this shows that this detailed section will only show the information above. We are able to generate the EFC from the ISIR as well as the GPA information. The other information would be filled in once the award has been processed. So application type is empty, pending for FAFSA CADAA, or if there is no GPA will be listed. If there is none by late November, talk to your school counselor. Again, the deadline is October 1st, and CSAC starts to do matching and do award notifications in mid to late November. So if the student isn't matching or the school didn't do it, make sure to be on top of that as well. And you can contact CSAC for support if the counselor isn't helpful for some reason. Next slide. So I want to just conclude by sharing some great resources to support the FAFSA completion process. Next slide. So there, on this slide, it shows general resources for completing the FAFSA. The U.S. Department of Education has a free hotline. There is a number specifically for FSAID. Also, email the U.S. Department of Education with any issues as well. Next slide. And then also, Schoolhouse Connection has a web page with a host of resources about the FAFSA specifically for students who have experienced homelessness. So that link is there. In addition, we also want to point out JBay's visual guide that walks through the FAFSA screen by screen. In case you didn't get enough information from today's webinar, this is a great resource as well. Next slide. And if you want to practice and have an interactive experience in terms of learning the ins and outs of the FAFSA, you can also practice on this demo site listed here as well. Next slide. So as we've noted throughout this presentation, filling out the FAFSA is just the first step. While a detailed process, we hope that we have provided you with some tools to understand the step-by-step details on completing the FAFSA correctly. It's worth dedicating the time to make sure that all students, especially those experiencing homelessness, get the maximum financial aid possible to encourage equity and inclusion in higher education and a path to financial sustainability and career satisfaction. So thanks so much for sticking with us with this very detailed overview of the FAFSA. I now want to, I think we have a couple of minutes to open it up to Q&A. And what questions do we have?
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you, Melissa. So we've had a lot of great questions coming in through the chat. We've been trying to answer them if they've come in, but Anna Faye, I have one question I want to direct to you. Somebody was asking about the at-risk part of the homelessness definition. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what constitutes being at risk?
Well, can you hear me? I just want to make sure.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. Well, I have an example. Would that be is a student who is currently, let's say, living with a relative temporarily, and they're at risk of being kicked out. So that's my definition of at risk of being homeless, because at some point in the near future, the student will be kicked out of whatever living situation that they're currently in, whether it's even an apartment, let's say, that they're sharing a room with, right? It's not permanent, it's temporary, so they're at risk of being homeless.
Great, thank you.
That's my definition. So like in the definition of being homeless, right, it's not permanent. Their living situation is not permanent. They could be on the streets in the near future.
Great. I'm going to take a couple of questions myself here. So one, people are asking about getting the PowerPoint. I just want to remind folks that you can download the PowerPoint from your control panel under handouts, and we will also be sending it out to anybody who registered for today's webinar. One quick question somebody is asking, is there a demo site for the DREAM Act application? Not that I'm aware of, but it does mirror the FAFSA for the most part. So if you spend some time on the FAFSA, you should be fairly familiar with the CADAA. A couple of questions have come in about mailing addresses for students who are homeless. So just for folks to be aware, there's two places where an address goes. So when you're filling out an address for the IRS data retrieval tool, you have to put the address that was included when the student filed their taxes. But the address that you're including in the FAFSA, if they don't have a mailing address, they can either, if they have a reliable friend or family member who can safely collect mail for them, they can use that, or they should talk to their college, because the college can also provide them typically with a way to be able to access mail through the campus itself. There's another question, Anna Faye, I'm going to give this one to you. If a student is living with a family member but doesn't have contact with their parents and is unable to provide tax information for parents, is there any kind of alternative process? You know, this is a student who isn't necessarily homeless, but is there any alternative process a student could talk to their financial aid office about to not have to get tax information from their parents?
Yes, so the student may request for what we call the dependency status evaluation or dependency override. If the student hasn't had any contact with the parents, that could qualify. So the student should make an appointment with a financial aid administrator. The financial aid administrator at the college may request some sort of third-party documentation. So that could be, let's say, a statement from a relative that the student is living in to explain or confirm the situation. It could be a letter from a social worker or a family friend or things like that. So it really depends on what other documentation that the college will require, but it appears just from that, the question, that the student may qualify for a dependency status change, which is outside from the homeless youth definition.
Great, thank you. So I think we're pretty much at time here. I think many of the other questions we were able to answer in the chat, but if we didn't get to your question or you have a very specific situation, you are welcome to go ahead and email us, and we can do our best to try to address your question. But I want to be respectful of people's time, and we are at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much to all of our presenters today. Thank you all of you for being here and for submitting your great questions. Again, we will be emailing a copy of the PowerPoint to everybody, as well as a link to the recording and the visual guide. We'll stay on a couple of minutes and continue to answer questions through the chat. So if you ask the question and you want to hang out, we'll try to answer it through the chat in the next couple of minutes. But for everybody else, this ends today's webinar. Thank you.